From Pacifica Radio, this is Democracy Now!
Given the history of other refugees in the last 50 years, it seems unlikely that this action on the part of NATO and the United States is going to produce anything except more destruction.
If we're willing to be honest, we see instantly that it cannot possibly be an operation resulting from humanitarian concerns.
Professors Noam Chomsky and Edward Said on the bombing of Yugoslavia. A conversation with Guardian reporter Maggie O'Kane, just expelled from Yugoslavia, and the Duma debates impeachment articles against Russian President Boris Yeltsin. All that and more coming up on Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! Welcome to Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. The Serbs say the NATO bombing has taken a heavy toll on civilian lives. Yugoslav media report NATO attacks killed 50 civilians and wounded some 50 others. The Serbs claim Allied aircraft dropped 8 cluster bombs on a village about 40 miles southwest of Kosovo's capital, Prizden. Reports say the wounded were mostly women, children, and the elderly. NATO today said it had conducted its heaviest bombing of the campaign, but hasn't been able to confirm any civilian casualties. Human Rights Watch sent a letter yesterday to NATO Secretary General Javier Solana expressing concern at the mounting civilian casualties in NATO's war against Yugoslavia. In particular, Human Rights Watch raised serious concerns about whether NATO is targeting civilians or objects that, if attacked, would cause disproportionate harm to civilians. It also questioned whether, even in attacking legitimate military targets, NATO is taking all feasible precautions to avoid harm to civilians. Among recent incidents giving rise to these concerns are the destruction of factories and other property belonging to political supporters of Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic, attacks on Yugoslavia's electrical transformers, and the destruction of several of Yugoslavia's television and radio stations, as well as the May 7th bombing of the civilian hospital in Niš and the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. As debate intensifies over the use of depleted uranium weapons in the Balkans conflict, a former Pentagon advisor has come out against them. Dr. Doug Rockey, a health physicist who led the cleanup of depleted uranium immediately after the Gulf War, believes Pentagon officials have made, quote, a political decision and are totally unwilling to recognize that there are health consequences the use of DU. Dr. Rockey says the force of the impact of a depleted uranium round converts much of it into a spray of burning uranium dust. Anyone who's inhaled or ingested the dust or who has let it enter a wound requires immediate medical treatment. Russia condemned the United States and Britain today for killing civilians in the bomb attack on northern Iraq, saying it was proof that the West does not respect international human rights. 12 people were killed and others wounded when Western warplanes bombed civilian targets in the city of Mosul on Wednesday. U.S. and British planes patrol the U.S., British, Turkey imposed no-fly zones over northern and southern Iraq. The Russian Foreign Ministry was quoted as saying, the number of civilian victims is growing and there's an ongoing systematic destruction of Iraq's economic infrastructure. The world ought to know about this dramatic situation in Iraq. The new Roman Catholic Archbishop of San Juan has criticized the U.S. Navy's bombing of a Puerto Rican island. Roberto Gonzalez Nieves, who this month replaced Cardinal Luis Aponte Martinez as head of the church's operations in the Puerto Rican capital, said he supported protesters who are trying to end 58 years of military exercises on the island of Vieques. Gonzalez Nieves said, after so many years of military exercises, it seems to me it's time already to give the people of Vieques a new chapter of peace and tranquility. Church leaders and politicians are calling for an end to military exercises on the island following the April 19th death of a civilian security guard when a bomb fell off target. Since then, protesters have camped out in the military training ground to demand the Navy relinquish its control of 70% of the 4 by 20-mile island. The Navy says it intends to give up 830 acres of unused land, but has not said when. A day after Senate Republicans defeated a Democratic proposal to require background checks on buyers at gun shows, they turned around and advocated a measure of their own that they say would do precisely that, a startling reversal that reflected their skittishness about being portrayed as soft on guns. The legislative fate of the Republican surprise proposal was undecided as of last night, but the very fact that it had been introduced demonstrated the potency of the gun control issue. And a Senate panel rejected appeals by the Pentagon's civilian and military leaders for more base closures, voting 11-9 yesterday to defeat a proposal that would have authorized a new round of closings in the year 2001. You are listening to Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. Russian lawmakers were urged today not to impeach Boris Yeltsin after the Kremlin warned that any move to remove the president would be a declaration of war and plunge Russia into crisis. Kremlin officials made the stark warnings overnight before the lower chamber of parliament, the Duma, began a second day of hearings on 5 charges. Opposition leaders predict at least one of the charges will be passed. Impeaching Yeltsin, quote, will seriously aggravate the political situation and be a declaration of war. This, according to a senior Kremlin official, quoted as saying this by the TASS news agency. We turn now to Fred Weir. He is the Moscow correspondent for Canadian Press, which is the national newswire for Canada, the equivalent of the Canadian Associated Press. He's also a contributing writer for In These Times magazine. Fred Weir, thanks for joining us from Moscow. Let's start off by you telling us what exactly is happening.
Yesterday, today, and tomorrow, the Duma will be debating 5 articles of impeachment against Yeltsin. Tomorrow, Saturday, they'll vote on each of the 5 separately. And if even one of them gets a 2/3 majority in the Duma, the impeachment process will be launched.
And can you explain what the charges are?
Yeah, there are 5 charges, and they cover quite a gamut of the sort of disappointments and disasters of the last decade. The first one is Yeltsin's guilt for conspiring to dissolve the Soviet Union illegally in 1991. The second charge concerns his great power play in 1993 when he dissolved the opposition-dominated parliament and then brought troops and tanks into Moscow to forcibly disband it when it resisted him. And he then wrote a new constitution. Ironically, that's the one he's now being impeached under. The next charge is his launching of the war in Chechnya in 1994. He never consulted with Parliament or any other body of power. The war was carried out under his signature alone, lasted 2 years, and an estimated 80,000 people died. The fourth charge is that Yeltsin underfunded and neglected the Russian army and armed forces, thereby fatally undermining the defense potential of the country. The last charge is that his market reforms led to falling birth rates and plunging life expectancy, leading the Russian population to shrink by 500,000 a year over the last 6 years, and the article of impeachment calls that genocide. So those are the 5 charges. They're legally dubious, although they've been all prepared by lawyers, but they are emotionally explosive. You know, opinion polls show that many Russians, like in almost all cases, a vast majority of Russians do react very favorably to the charges, like that. Yes, Yeltsin is responsible and he must be impeached on this. The only 2 that don't seem to be like that strong, especially among younger Russians, are the charge about conspiring to destroy the Soviet Union and the power struggle in 1993. The other 3, all 3 of them get well over 2/3 support from people in the street.
And in terms of what impeachment charge is likely to fly, which one would actually pass? Would it be the war in Chechnya?
Yeah, the war. Everyone says that the charge on Yeltsin holding Yeltsin responsible for the war in Chechnya is very likely to get the necessary 300 votes out of the 450 Duma members. That you can do that calculation just on the basis of which political fractions support which, and that's one charge which the Liberal Party, Yabloko, Grigory Yavlinsky's party, actually prepared in the impeachment commission. Their lawyers prepared it, and they've said that they will support it. So that seems the most likely. But the charge on 1993 events may also, is less likely, but could conceivably also get enough votes.
That was the army opening fire on the parliament and killing more than 100 people.
Yeah, 200 people. Yes, that one. The others are long shots, but parliamentarians are very, very angry right now, this week, over the firing of the Prime Minister, Yevgeny Primakov. So there's a bit of, uncertainty about what they might do tomorrow.
Can you then talk about the significance of this? I mean, let's say they do vote one or more counts of impeachment against Boris Yeltsin. Does this mean he gets kicked out of office?
Not immediately, and probably not ever. As I said, he wrote that constitution, and he didn't make impeachment of the president an easy affair. And now the charge, should one of them, say, be passed by the Duma, it must go to the Supreme Court, which will check it for its legal correctness. That is, yes, this is indeed a crime, and then to the Constitutional Court, which will check it for its technical correctness. That is, that it's correctly expressed, the language is right, and so on. Both those bodies are stacked with Yeltsin appointees, and they may easily find some technical reason to scuttle the whole business. And if the two courts do approve the charge, it must then go into the Federation Council, which is the upper house of Parliament, and it's a sort of a conclave of regional leaders. And there, too, it must get a two-thirds vote in support. And only then would the president technically be removed from office.
Well, Fred Weir, can you explain to us what actually is going on right now in Russia, and especially in light of the bombing of Yugoslavia and the role that the Russian Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov was playing until he was ousted by Yeltsin? What actually is happening, not to mention whether Boris Yeltsin is really even completely alive?
Yeah, well, I think that the fact that we have this crisis blowing up this week is just as good evidence as you could hope to see that Yeltsin is still alive. This is absolutely his style, to find himself playing a losing hand politically, and instead of sharpening his tactics or something, he turns over the game table. That's his way. And the firing of Primakov definitely put Russia on track for a very serious constitutional crisis, one way or another. He was throwing down the gauntlet to the Duma and inviting them for a major confrontation by doing that. And so all calculations about Russia's political events now are up in the air. It's very unpredictable what will happen in the next week or 2 or 3 weeks. And everything else is held hostage to it. The Russia's role as a mediator in Yugoslavia will be sacrificed if Yeltsin feels it's necessary for one reason or another to strengthen his position. The IMF loan that Primakov did negotiate with great difficulty now is up in the air. It's very unlikely that the Duma will pass the legislation that was supposed to be passed as a condition of the loan, because the Duma worked well with Primakov. They considered him the prime minister that they had chosen and had good relations with him. Whoever Yeltsin proposes, including Stepashin, the man whose name he's put before the Duma, is not going to be able to work with the Duma. And therefore, it's whatever happens, we're in for very stormy weather.
We're talking to Fred Weir in Moscow. We're talking to Fred Weir. He is the Moscow correspondent for the Canadian Press, which is the national newswire of Canada, and also a contributor to In These Times magazine. Can you talk about Yeltsin's sacking of the Russian Prime Minister, Yevgeny Primakov?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, Primakov was a very smart, very competent leader, but of a conservative, older school, Gorbachev-era man. His idea was to rebuild Russia's strength as a great power, use the state as an economic lever to perhaps protect Russian industries, rebuild our defense industries, and so on. This is not popular in the West, which is why I don't think you hear any loud protests about Primakov's sacking. But it wasn't really why Yeltsin fired him. Why Yeltsin fired him was because he is such a strong and canny bureaucratic infighter, and he was consolidating power. Opinion polls showed that, last week, Primakov, had a presidential election been held last week, Primakov would have come in first. This sent the message to Yeltsin, who cannot stand sharing power with anybody, or the idea that he himself is mortal or will have to leave office one day and be replaced. This seems to be a very human thing with Yeltsin. He's just like King Lear or something. He cannot contemplate the world after him, and anybody who reminds him of that goes down the road.
So what will happen to Primakov right now?
Well, Primakov is probably out in his country dacha, relaxing for the first time in months. I don't think you'll see Primakov come back, although people are saying this makes it more and more likely that he'll run for president. He is probably finished and will pass into history, and of all these last turbulent years, he will probably be the best remembered leader. But no, for better or for worse, Yeltsin has plunged Russia into a whole new chapter of its political history, and I don't think Primakov will figure in it.
What does this mean for nuclear weapons?
Well, the situation with Russian nuclear weapons, which Americans are always, I guess, most concerned about, is the same as it was. Unless some really, really dramatic events occur within Russia's, upper circles, I don't think there's any immediate worry about the security of Russia's nuclear arsenal. There are long-term worries about it because the armed forces are unraveling, and even the nuclear rocket forces have had very serious security breaches. Still, in the short term, I don't think there's any special worry about that. In the longer term, all these things, the war in Yugoslavia, and these political upsets and upheavals make it far less likely that the Russian parliament will ratify the START II treaty. That is, nuclear arms control, which has really been on the shelf for quite a long time, is unlikely to resume anytime soon.
And what is the attitude of the Russian people toward the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia?
Well, all opinion polls, and if you go out into the street and talk to people, are overwhelmingly negative. Russians focused on this like nothing else in the last several years as a symbol of how far Russia has fallen in the world, how insecure and threatened they now feel. I mean, a lot of the emotion, the anti-Western, pro-Serbian emotion that Russians express, and they do almost, you just have to go out in the street and talk to almost anybody. A lot of that can't be literal. A lot of it is clearly their bitterness and frustration over the economic failures of the country, over social insecurities they feel. But for whatever reason, NATO's attack on Yugoslavia became the lightning rod for all that.
And so now, though, Russia will step out of playing a key role.
I don't know that that's true. I think it's very important for Russia and certainly for the foreign policy establishment here. After they got over their shock about it, they saw it as an opportunity for Russia to return to the table of the big players and to do something which would restore its credibility in the world, and that it still is that. I'm sure that Russian in the foreign ministry, they're still working on various game plans where Russia would mediate between the West and Yugoslavia and produce some kind of a settlement on that. But the political struggle going on, and Yeltsin yesterday threatened that Russia would pull out. That's domestic. That's him playing domestic politics, because Russians are angry about that. And this, but I wouldn't overstate that. I don't think that Yeltsin's statements really make that much difference to what the Russian establishment wants to do. At least I hope they don't.
And who is Sergei Stepashin, the president's nominee to replace Yevgeny Primakov as prime minister?
Stepashin is an old policeman. Like he started his career in the Interior Ministry, which is sort of like what would it be comparable to the FBI in the United States? It's the national police force. But in Russia, the Interior Ministry is also an army with many divisions of combat troops. With tanks and armored personnel carriers and rocket launchers and helicopters and things. And he was when he was the head of the Interior Ministry, he was the main hawk in Chechnya. He was the guy who, more than any other underling, is considered to have been to blame for the war, for it going on and being so bloody. And he is clearly that type of guy, a man from the security services, and he is a long-term, proven Yeltsin loyalist. I think these are the qualities that led Yeltsin to nominate him, and that kind of makes a mockery of Yeltsin's statement that he was firing Primakov because urgent economic changes were required. If that were the case, he would have appointed an economist, you'd think. But he appointed a policeman, and that doesn't bode very well at all.
Fred Weir, thanks very much for joining us from Moscow. Fred Weir is the Moscow correspondent for the Canadian Press, the equivalent of the Canadian Associated Press, and a contributor to In These Times magazine. When we come back, Noam Chomsky and Edward Said on the bombing of Yugoslavia. You're listening to Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! We will be back in a minute. Listening to Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. NATO said today it's checking reports that 50 civilians are killed in southwestern Kosovo when it hit Yugoslavia overnight with the heaviest raid since it began bombing on March 24th. Serb media in the Kosovan capital of Prizden said at least 50 civilians were killed and more than 50 wounded during the night when NATO planes dropped cluster bombs on the village of Korisa, about 6 miles northeast of Prizren. Many of the victims are reported to be women, children, and the elderly. As the mainstream media in the United States continues to cover the war in Yugoslavia through the voices of retired generals, NATO spokespeople, and U.S. government and military officials, today we bring you voices of dissent that have been effectively censored everywhere else. We'll turn to two of America's leading dissidents, Noam Chomsky and Edward Said. They spoke giving major addresses at Columbia University in New York City on the state of the Middle East. Afterwards, they had a dialogue about the bombing of Yugoslavia. Professor Noam Chomsky is a world-renowned linguist, scholar, and political analyst. Among his books, Manufacturing Consent and Profit Over People. Professor Edward Said teaches English and comparative literature at Columbia University. He's also written over a dozen books, including Peace and Its Discontents, Essays on Palestine and the Middle East Peace Process, Orientalism and Culture and Imperialism. He was a member of the Palestine Liberation Council until he quit between 1977 and 1991. We begin with Professor Edward Said.
I don't want to give a whole thing on the current situation in Yugoslavia, but a number of things need to be said. In the first place, obviously, I mean, I tried to emphasize this in my talk. I mean, I see the evils of ethnic cleansing and forced dispossession, which is taking place by the forces of Serbia under Milosevic, and there's obviously a parallel there between what happened to Palestinians in 1948. And I certainly want also to add, since you talked about Iraq, that there can be no brief at all for what Saddam Hussein has wrought on the people of Iraq and the neighborhood. But one should remember that these are not things that happened out of context and just we suddenly discovered the monstrosity of these regimes. Saddam was supported very, very methodically during the 80s, especially during the Iran-Iraq war, by the United States and the European powers. And Milosevic was always involved. I mean, the Dayton Accord made a point of really sort of sidelining the Bosnians and dealing with Milosevic. And the Kosovars, of course. So the policy now of bombing has to be seen in the context of U.S. moves elsewhere. That is to say, at the same time that this action is taking place, a kind of clean war, safe war, no U.S. pilots hurt, etc., with these smart bombs and so on and so forth, devastation of a country. There is a war being waged by a NATO ally, Turkey, against the Kurds. 46,000 Kurds have been killed, and not a word has been said about this by the United States, which simply tolerates it. I think these false dichotomies, either you're with, as it used to be said during the Gulf War, either you're for fascism or you're for imperialism, and you have to be for imperialism because it's always slightly better than fascism. I mean, fascism being such. These are the kind of false dichotomies we're placed into at the current moment, and I think that the net result, again, without any particular plan, without any notion of what's going to be done afterwards, given the history of other refugees in the last 50 years, it seems unlikely that this action on the part of NATO and the United States is going to produce anything except more destruction and more fragmentation and dispossession, and probably at the end Clinton will walk away and say he had a success.
Well, I'll be brief. I think the first thing we ought to do when facing this, it's a difficult and complicated issue, but the first thing we at least ought to agree is to be honest. If we don't want to be honest, then let's just stop the discussion. If we're willing to be honest, we see instantly that it cannot possibly be an operation resulting from humanitarian concerns. I mean, that's just trivial. Let's take the one example that Edward mentioned, in which, incidentally, I disagree with him. He said that the U.S. ignored the Turkish atrocities in Kurdistan, which is absolutely untrue, as he agrees, I'm sure. The U.S. worked as hard as it could to escalate those atrocities. In fact, and this is not ancient history. I mean, atrocities in southeastern Turkey, which are well beyond Kosovo, peaked in 1994. It was the peak year of atrocities. It was also the peak year of U.S. provision of weapons under Clinton to Turkey. That included jet planes, napalm, anti-personnel weapons, tanks, all of which were used. In fact, Turkey became the biggest importer of weapons in the world, thanks to the huge supply of weapons that Clinton was offering them to consummate a destruction and massacre, which unfortunately is well beyond what's happening in Kosovo, or had happened. Remember, 2,000 people were killed there last year, according to NATO. And in fact, Clinton even had to evade congressional restrictions. Human rights groups found that U.S. jets were being used illegally to bomb Kurds, and the humanitarian Clinton had to find ways of evading those restrictions to allow the jet planes to keep going, to keep bombing Kurds. So that's just one example of many. There's no possibility that this is a humanitarian operation. That leaves us with the question whether you should carry it out. Okay, separate question. So now you look and see. Where were we on March 24th when the bombing started? Well, there, according to NATO, had been 2,000 people killed in the past year as Serbians responded brutally to KLA attacks on police stations and so on. And so you might ask yourself how the United States would respond to attacks on police stations in New York by a guerrilla group being supported by, say, Libya and based across the border. I'll just put that aside. But in any event, the response was brutal. A couple thousand people were killed, a few 100,000 refugees. On March 24th, the way the situation stood was, well, I actually learned something interesting in the New York Times yesterday, hidden down at the bottom of a column, the place where it's usually useful to begin reading. Turns out, I didn't know this before, that the Serbian parliament had called for, before the bombing, had called for UN forces to be in Kosovo as observers, whereas the U.S. was insisting on NATO forces. Well, that's consistent with U.S. contempt for and hatred for the United Nations or any other international institution, but it does put a rather different cast on the situation. There were clearly negotiating opportunities and options that could be pursued. The U.S. picked one option. It was an option which was guaranteed, practically, to make the situation far worse. I won't express my opinion. Let me just quote the U.S. NATO commander. On March 26th, Wesley Clark, 2 days after the bombing started, he said, in his words, it was entirely predictable that as a result of the bombing, there would be a vast escalation of Serbian atrocities on the ground. Well, you know, entirely predictable is too strong. The world isn't that simple. Nothing's entirely predictable. But it was certainly pretty obvious that they were going to react somehow, and they were going to react where they have strength. Well, they don't have strength in the air. They have strength on the ground. So they were going to react the way they did, you know, by sharply increasing the attacks and so on. If you look at the number of refugees, the UN had registered 0 refugees in Albania and Macedonia. There were some, but they weren't registered by the UN as of March 26th, in fact. That's when the refugee flow started. It's after the bombing. The effects of the bombing, rather predictably, not entirely predictably, as the NATO general stated, rather predictably were to sharply increase the damage to the populations, the harm to the populations, very severely, all populations. Other effects were to wipe out a very promising and courageous democratic movement in Belgrade, which was the best hope for getting rid of this gangster Milosevic with whom we'd been dealing. It's having, I mean, everyone rallies around the flag, you know, just the way we would do if New York started getting bombed. So that's gone, at least for the moment, maybe forever. The very harsh effects in the surrounding regions. There is yet another attack on the system of international law and world order. Well, like if you're Saddam Hussein, you don't take this very seriously. But maybe not everybody accepts the standards of Saddam Hussein. Maybe there's some people who think that we ought to have some sort of regime of international order which provides at least some support for the weak. Doesn't provide any support for the strong. They don't need it. But it provides the restrictions against the use of force provide some protection for the weak. Okay, we have another blow against that. In fact, across the board, it's a disaster. It's a human disaster. In fact, forgetting even the possibility that this had humanitarian motives, which of course it didn't, we have to ask what it meant. Well, that's approximately what it meant. It doesn't look very much in doubt. And it looks as if there were alternatives. And there still are alternatives, as there always are. In fact, let me just put the whole thing at a kind of mundane level. Like, suppose you walk out in the street this evening and you see a crime being committed. You know, somebody's robbing someone else. Well, you have 3 choices. One choice is to try to stop it. You know, like maybe you call 911 or something. Another choice is to do nothing. A third choice is to pick up an assault rifle and kill them both, and kill the bystanders at the same time. Well, suppose you do that, and somebody says, "Well, why'd you do that?" And they said, "Look, I couldn't stand by and do nothing." I mean, is that a response? Why? I mean, if you can think of nothing that wouldn't do harm, then do nothing. And the same is true, magnified in international affairs, apart from the fact that there were things that could have been done.
But I want to add one other thing, if I may. That is, at the same time that this war is going on, the United States is continuing to bomb Iraq, again on the bottom pages of the New York Times. And I think one of the demonstrations, I think, behind the action in Yugoslavia is a kind of projection of U.S. power and the assertion that the U.S. can fight regional wars, more than one, maybe 2, 3, 4 at a time. And interestingly, one of your favorite columnists, Tom Friedman, the other day was saying in the New York Times that it's a sort of repetition of some of the tactics used during the Indo-Chinese episode. That is to say, to appear as irrational as possible. And he was advocating the unreasonable use of force. In other words, just for the sake of the force, not to achieve any particular results, but to show the people who is boss. And I think that mentality is very much part of it. And second point to be made is the continued attack upon the United Nations. That is to say, the United Nations is useful in Iraq. They can use resolutions that the United States pushed through. Continued arrears in dues, the continued scorn for attempts at peacemaking, and so on and so forth, as in Rwanda in 1994. But essentially, the United Nations is a contemptible body, and as most people in the Senate and the House boast, they've never been out of the United States, don't even have a passport. So why should we care about the world body that tries to take sovereignty away from the United Nations? I think that's also part of it. That this is an assertion of world number one, without much interest at all in any possible outcome that anyone can possibly see is anything but bleak.
If I can just, I guess we should leave it to you, but let me just say that on this matter of looking irrational, Thomas Friedman didn't make it up. That's official U.S. policy.
It is, yeah.
There is a national defense, I forget the name of it, in 1995, which proposed that, it's been partially declassified, which proposed that the United States should maintain an irrational posture. We should look like a dangerous, irrational state, because that will frighten people, and we should use the nuclear arsenal that way. The more uncertain they are, the more power we have. Now, there's actually an Orwellian phrase for this, which is repeated by Clinton and his little puppy dog, Tony Blair, and Madeleine Albright, and everyone else. The phrase is, we have to preserve the credibility of NATO. That's the main argument that's given. Well, try to decode that. Are they worried about the credibility of Denmark, of Italy? No. Credibility of NATO means credibility of the United States. Now, what does credibility mean? Well, credibility means like what any mafia don would understand. If somebody doesn't pay, what they're supposed to do in a grocery store, the don has to maintain credibility. Other people have to understand that you don't do this, Credibility means be frightened of the enforcer. And that, once you carry out the translation, I think you can see what's going on. And I think it's exactly what Edward said. That's a major motivation. You have to preserve the credibility of the enforcer. If you do it by being irrational and violent and destructive, well, that's where the cookie crumbles.
I have a tiny footnote to this is to bring it back to the Middle East. It's the rationale for Israeli policy in Lebanon. Yeah, where you occupy a strip of land, you say this is to protect yourself, so you occupy more land inside another sovereign state. And then you mete out punishment through mercenaries, but certainly by the clean bombing, the use of aircraft and so on and so forth. And then, of course, when you meet resistance, you call them terrorists. And what's interesting is how the U.S. press has followed along with this logic, so that whenever they talk about the Hezbollah guerrillas in southern Lebanon fighting the Israeli occupation. They're always referred to as Iran-supported terrorists, Hezbollah, and so on and so forth. But the footnote I wanted actually to bring attention to was around just before the middle of March. It must have been around the 11th or 12th of March. The Israelis invaded further north. They took another area in a town called Anun, just north of the security zone in southern Lebanon. And they surrounded it. They took the village, just kicked out most of the inhabitants, and put barbed wire around it. A couple of days later, there were big demonstrations in Beirut, and a bunch of students came down from Beirut by bus to Arnoun in South Lebanon, to this newly occupied town north of the Israeli zone, but which was just recently occupied by the Israelis. And they stood in front of the barbed wire, warned off. The Israelis shot rifles in the air, warned that the wires were full of electricity, that there were landmines, and so on and so forth. And then, as it happens in situations of crowds and so on, a couple of them, of the Lebanese students, attacked the barbed wire, which of course was not wired. There were no landmines, and liberated the town. And the Israeli soldiers, with all their arms, ran away. It's a small episode in a generally not very distinguished history of conflict, but it does show at times that the bully can be confronted.
Professors Edward Said of Columbia University and Noam Chomsky of Massachusetts Institute of Technology speaking just a few weeks ago at Columbia University. You're listening to Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. Smiling and waving to the cameras, about 120 Yugoslav troops left Kosovo yesterday in a convoy of buses and trucks in what Western authorities said was an insignificant move. Meanwhile, Yugoslavia told the United Nations that more than 1,200 people have been killed and 5,000 hurt by NATO airstrikes over the past 7 weeks. As foreign reporters saw the military convoy leave Kosovo, a Serb army officer there blamed constant NATO bombing for the, quote, slow pace of withdrawal since Yugoslavia announced a partial pullout. We turn right now to Maggie O'Kane. She was in Yugoslavia for the last 5 weeks covering the war until this past week she was thrown out by Yugoslav authorities. Maggie O'Kane is a reporter for the British newspaper The Guardian. She is speaking to us from Belfast. Maggie O'Kane, tell us what happened.
Well, I feel it reminds me a bit of when I was a child. My father used to come and pick me up at 10 o'clock from the Gaelic football pitch on a summer's evening, and I had to go home early. And I must say I felt a bit like that when I left Belgrade, a sense that I had to go home early.
What happened?
Well, what happened was that I was expelled from Belgrade after spending almost 5 weeks there working. The reason I was expelled, I don't really know. I came back to my hotel, and there was a very gentlemanly policeman who accompanied me to my room, and we had a cup of tea, and he said that my services or my work was no longer required in Belgrade, and that I should leave the country within 24 hours. And with that, he left, and they stamped in my passport that I had to be out of the country, and they disqualified my visa. So that was it. I mean, why exactly I went, they wanted me to go, I don't know. I certainly am not the first one to be expelled from Belgrade. There had been some criticism of my work before in Bosnia, but certainly it wasn't made clear to me what they objected to. I suspect that there had been a run of stories about opposition, about the fact that there was that the voices of opposition were being raised within Belgrade against President Milosevic, and perhaps that made them uncomfortable, or perhaps they didn't like the colour of my shoes. I really don't know.
Can you talk about what some of your coverage has been over the last 5 years? What are for example, the last stories that you were working on while you were in Belgrade?
Well, the last story I did was a story about called The Cleaner, and it was a sort of it was an interview with a volunteer Serb who had gone to Kosovo to clean, as he called it, and he discussed how they operated. He was part of a sort of voluntary force who I suspect weren't as brutal as those that we've heard about. And that was the last interview I did. The other work was mainly looking at the sense that there was a rising voice from the opposition, which was very, very quickly quelled. But certainly there were people who were brave enough to say this can't go on and Milosevic must stand down, which is extraordinary given the climate in the country.
I'm still focused on this cleaner. How did you find him, and what exactly did he say he did, and why did he volunteer to go to Kosovo?
Well, I found him. I ran into a Belgrade Buddhist who, a very interesting man. He was a pacifist and also had been a protester. And he just mentioned that his next door neighbour, that they'd taken to calling him the cleaner because after the NATO bombing started, a number of Belgrade men volunteered to go to fight for Kosovo. He would call himself a strong nationalist. He would believe, as he said, that he was fighting the Kosovo Liberation Army, who were extremists bent on taking Kosovo from the Serbs. And how he described it was quite interesting. He said, we were given very strict orders. There was to be no murder, no mutilation, and no rape. And those were the instructions that were issued in Niš by the deputy commander of the Third Force, and they were the words that he used to me. And he also made comparisons. He'd been in the Croatian War, and he said that in a way that was a lot dirtier. There was a lot more blood on our hands. And I suspect, having covered Bosnia and Croatia, that it's very hard to estimate the scale of, for example, rape, which was a big issue in Bosnia. I have no doubt that there was systematic rape as part of the process of ethnic cleansing. My sense about Kosovo is that while I'm sure there have been cases of rape, if it wasn't carried out in the same systematic way. And the interesting thing about the cleaner is, he was in his own kind of rather naive way saying we weren't allowed to rape them this time, if you know what I mean. So I think that sort of said a lot about the way that the war has been conducted in Kosovo. I'm not saying it's clean, I think it's very brutal, but I think that there is less of the kind of sense of it being as out of control as it was in Bosnia. Certainly that was the case in the first couple of weeks, and that may change.
Maggie O'Kane, what about your coverage of the NATO bombing, the U.S.-British bombing with NATO of Yugoslavia? How were you covering that, and what were the effects you were seeing in Belgrade and the other cities that you visited?
Well, I think there's two levels. I mean, there's two levels in Belgrade. There's a level of going downtown every morning at 9:30 when you've had your breakfast. We all stayed in the Hyatt Hotel, which is the most luxurious place I've ever stayed. And the reason for that is that we were actually told that we had to stay together, and they wanted to monitor where the journalists were. I tried to book into another hotel, and they said no. So, you go downtown, and what you would be confronted with was a city that, in a way, was very normal. People were walking around. The only sign in those first few weeks that anything was really wrong was that there was huge queues for cigarettes. But other than that, it was any comparatively affluent, although we know now that it's not because of the sanctions. But you have a sense of a kind of busy Eastern European capital, and people going about their business. And then in the middle of all this, there was this surreal madness of going downtown in the middle of the night, being woken up by the sound of missiles, and the sound of one in particular, which I remember going across the roof of the hotel, which was like a rasp of like a wild cat. It was a very, very chilling, evil sound before it hit the Communist Party headquarters. And there's that kind of, as I say, very surreal madness. And so what do? You cover, who the victims are, what happened, why this was a target. And I think the debate over the TV station was very controversial. I think there was a lot of anger about that. And, journalists called on to show their solidarity. But, I kind of feel that you also, if you're going to show solidarity, then you have to show it with the workers of Alexanats or the workers of the Hoover factory. But, I don't think we're in the business of solidarity. We're in the business of reporting.
We're talking to Maggie O'Kane, who is a foreign reporter for The Guardian. She was covering the bombing of Yugoslavia for the last 5 weeks and was just basically expelled from the country by the Yugoslav government of Slobodan Milosevic. She's now speaking to us from Belfast. Can you talk about the so-called collateral damage? In fact, it is words that Mary Robinson, the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, said should never be used, and she's extremely critical of the bombing and says that NATO, as well as NATO officials and Western officials, as well as Slobodan Milosevic, should be considered for indictments for war crimes, given that there are civilian targets.
Well, I don't think there are civilian targets. I think it basically, I have a sense, and my impression is very, very strongly that the civilian casualties have been a disaster as far as NATO is concerned. The bombing of the convoy, the bombing of Alexanas, the bombing of the civilians in the town of Slovenia, just south of the city, have been, caused huge political problems for NATO. What you see is very much, the aftermath of a smouldering building, of bodies being brought out. And we always arrive there, within half an hour, and it's at that time most of the bodies have gone. So it's very difficult to talk about that. I think any of us who are covering it find a huge kind of difficult moral dilemma between wondering how you bring back those refugees and how you, in a sense, win against the evil of ethnic cleansing that we've seen that I've seen in Croatia and Bosnia and now in Serbia, and how does that square with actually getting things wrong and hitting civilian targets? It's a hugely difficult moral question that I think we're all very confused about.
But as you described yourself, there was, for example, the targeting of the TV station. It's not as if the NATO bombers hit off the transmitters, and also journalists like from CNN apparently had advance warning, but others inside were killed.
Everyone had advance warning. There was a press conference 2 days before that at which the Ministry of Information said that we have been informed that the TV station is going to be a target. So people were told that it was going to be a target. Why they didn't, ring up 10 minutes before and say, the bomb's on the way, get out, I don't know. But I don't think it was a question of, CNN being told, whereas the Yugoslavs were told, weren't told anything. Everyone knew that was going to be targeted. And I also feel sort of slightly ambivalent on this whole issue. I believe that the television station, not that I'm saying it should be blown up, but I believe that the strongest pillar of Slobodan Milosevic's power is TV, and it's been a hugely successful, Serbian television have been hugely successful in allowing him to continue to perpetrate what he did in Bosnia and Croatia. And actually, this is the TV station that said that there were no Kosovan refugees, that the refugees are not being driven out by Serb forces, that it's all Western propaganda. So, I think it's not black and white. I think that it's clear that this was a pillar of the regime. I'm not saying that you should kill journalists in there, but I am saying there was a very clear warning.
Maggie O'Kane, you're known for going places and bringing out dissident voices, and there are many opposition voices in Belgrade and overall in the FRY, in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Can you talk about what's happened to that opposition during the bombing?
Well, one of the things that they said, and they said quite clearly, is that it was the bombing set back democracy in Serbia by 20 years. I mean, and in a way, I don't know if it was as bad as that, but there was a sense, as I found in Iraq in 1991, that there was a sense of solidarity behind Slobodan Milosevic, a growing popularity that he hadn't experienced since the early 80s. I think that's wearing quite thin. The opposition said, this is destroying us, but I think we've moved on to another stage now in which the people are beginning to be very, very angry and fed up as the electricity goes, as the oil supplies as the oil goes into short supplies, as there's no sugars, you can't get cigarettes. So I think that initial rallying of the great Serbian national spirit seemed almost to be diminishing day by day. In the first days of the war, we saw thousands of people gathered in Republika Square, waving the flag, singing the national anthem, and then within weeks, I suppose, that began to have a sort of hollow, weary sound as people are just growing tired. So I think what happened, and the opposition raised their voices, and they did so in a very sort of powerful and brave way. Vuko Bradovic, who was an opposition leader, said that Slobodan Milosevic must resign. Now, in Belgrade at this time, it's almost tantamount to saying the same thing in Baghdad in 1991, and within 2 weeks of the war, Cheruvia, a very outspoken critic of Milosevic, was shot dead in a crowded street on Saturday. So there are brave voices, and maybe people are ready to listen to them. But at the moment, it's hard to see how this is going to go.
You talk about the dilemma that many face of wanting the ethnic cleansing to end, but also not liking to see the bombing. But do you think that the bombing perhaps sped up, escalated ethnic cleansing at the same time that it has rallied support for Slobodan Milosevic?
Yes, I think that the bombing, as soon as the bombing started, it gave the Serb forces and perhaps some of the Serb people living there who felt so threatened by the growing Albanian population, the chance to say, okay, now we'll get rid of them now. I mean, I think there was a huge fury and backlash as a result of the bombing, which certainly escalated the ethnic cleansing.
And what about the effects on the environment of the bombing? You have the bombings of petrochemical factories. You have the toxins that are going into the Danube, what some countries at the United Nations are calling ecocide. Did you have a sense of that?
Well, there was. What concerns me much, much more is depleted uranium. I spent a lot of work in Iraq after the Gulf War, and during the Gulf War, depleted uranium, which is a very hard substance, which is put on the tips of bullets, which literally pierces armor like butter, a knife through soft butter. It's a very, very strong material. It's very much experimental. The first war it was used in was the Gulf War in 1991. And the research that's been done there, and work that I've done myself as well, it's clear that this is causing huge problems with the release of, albeit low-level radioactivity into the atmosphere, and concerns about genetic disorders in children. I mean, there is really, really grave concern about depleted uranium, and it's very worrying that we now sort of hear almost casually that the U.S. is saying, well, yes, we're using it again. And that worries me. I think it's terrifying what the potential for that is.
You have investigated depleted uranium extensively in Iraq. The Pentagon has admitted, the U.S. Pentagon, that it is using depleted uranium in Yugoslavia. Could you just expand on what you've said?
Well, what they've said is that they're using it in the DC-10s, and that they're using it as it's basically an armor-piercing substance, which is part of the armory of the U.S. They have said that they don't think that it causes a health threat. There are, however, there is much controversy about that, and there are those that believe that it is very dangerous. And I'm stunned, really. I thought that after the Gulf War they had learned their lesson, but clearly they haven't.
Having been expelled from the country by Slobodan Milosevic's men, will you try to go back?
Yeah.
Maggie O'Kane speaking to us from Belfast. She's a reporter with the British newspaper The Guardian. She was expelled from Yugoslavia just a few days ago. And that does it for today's program. Democracy Now! Is produced by Maria Carrion and David Love. Our technical director is Errol Maitland. Michael Eade is our headlines editor. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for listening to another edition of Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now!